Great. Well, welcome everyone. This is our Technology and Forest Carbon webinar series offered through the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative and the University of Minnesota Extension. We are really happy to not have this presentation today, but a different one, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we are happy to have support from the Minnesota Forest Resources Council to help put on this webinar series. Many of you Minnesota folks and Wisconsin folks too, I think, have attended some of our previous workshops and webinars in this series. We did a series back in September focused on forest carbon markets and what that means in terms of forest carbon and some other issues. And we also had a field tour associated with that. Last month, we had a field tour at the Chippewa National Forest looking at forest carbon and how it relates to silviculture and forest management. And this week, we're happy to be presenting these technology and forest carbon webinars, really focusing on kind of the technology behind a lot of what's going on in forest carbon market development in terms of forests and their role as natural climate solutions. And so we're really happy to be sharing this. I'm Matt Russell. I'm the host for today. I'm at the University of Minnesota. Eli Sagor is also going to be moderating the questions that come in, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. As I mentioned, many of you probably joined us on Monday. We had a great webinar on Monday that was focused on looking at reforestation opportunities with a new product that the Nature Conservancy has developed with a lot of partner organizations. Today, we're really happy to be talking about measurements to markets, how we might use artificial intelligence in the carbon market world. And so I'll introduce Brian and Nan here in a little bit. We would welcome you too to our last webinar in this series on Friday this week. On Friday this week, we'll have Chad Babcock with the Department of Forest Resources at the U of M talking about uncertainty in forest carbon mapping. And so we're really looking forward to that webinar here on Friday. In terms of how to ask questions, many of you that have attended our programs before are familiar with Slido. So Slido is a great application. It works on through your web browser, where you can ask questions, and we'll relay those to Brian and Nan as we go through the presentation. And so that short link will get you to the Slido website, and you can click on the day of today. It should say something like Wednesday, Brian and Nan are speaking, so click on that link and then type your question there. What we really like about the platform is that you can upvote things, and so you can like, star, and then that kind of indicates to us we might prioritize that question once we get to it. And so definitely type your question there. You can also reply to questions that come in. And so those might be useful things as you're going through here today. And so I'm sure that Eli will probably add that link to the Slido question and answer form in the chat. Otherwise, I will hand it over to Brian Clough first, and then followed by Nan Pond. So we're really happy to have NCX here to present on the work that they've been doing with carbon markets and how they're using technology as a part of their platform. So Brian is the Ecology Project Manager at NCX, and Nan is the Director of Forestry at NCX. And so really happy that they're here to share about what their company and their programs are up to. And again, feel free, we'll type some things into chat as we go along. But Brian, if you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Yep, sounds good. Is that coming through there? Looks great. Okay, great. Yep, thanks a lot for the introduction, Matt, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Nan and I are super excited to be participating in this webinar. Great series to kind of dig in on the technology side of the forest carbon world, which I think is certainly extremely helpful for everybody to understand. So Nan and I are both with NCX. We're a company that some of you may have previously known as Sylvia Terra when we were focused more on forest analytics consulting and forest inventory work. But we have now kind of rebranded, changed our name, and we're focusing our efforts specifically on building out our natural capital market program. So in terms of the game plan for the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about our program structure and how it works, and then I'll turn it over to Nan for a while to really get into the nuts and bolts of the technology that underlies our approach, with that being kind of the main focus of the talk. And then at the end, I'll loop back around a little bit to talk a little bit about what we're looking to do going forward, particularly related to other forms of natural capital besides carbon. So just first a little bit of context in terms of what motivates the work that we're doing here at NCX. We're really interested in addressing what we see as a very significant global market failure in terms of the proper valuation of forests. So this is a quote here from a report on the Boston Consulting Group citing that the world's forests can be valued as much as 150 trillion, with most of that accounted for the ability of forests to regulate climate change through carbon storage, as well as other forms of natural capital as well, right? Think fire risk mitigation, water quality, biodiversity protection, et cetera, et cetera. So, despite this kind of diversity of values that, if you want to put it in terms of raw dollars, can be monetized at pretty significant scales, it's really only one form of natural capital that roughly one form of natural capital that we're taking off of forests and actually trading in, which are harvested wood products, right? So our goal as a company at NCX is to figure out solutions that will help better leverage all these other forms of natural capital that can be taken from forests, with a real emphasis on designing programs that work well for everyone, from small landowners up to large TIMOs and REITs, and then provide the kind of credits that our buyers are really interested in purchasing. So, with that in mind, we've designed a program that is aimed at really lowering the barrier of entry for landowners to participate in forest carbon markets. So, kind of 3 points of criteria that really kind of help make this possible. We focus on 1-year harvest deferral terms, so carbon credits are generated in quote unquote ton year units. So much more flexibility for landowners, no enrollment fees and no minimum acreage. So our program is open, from everyone to small woodlawn owners, like I said, up to much larger industrial forest owners. And, it's really the technology that makes this possible. So, specifically over the last 5 or 10 years, the absolute revolution in terms of the widespread availability of remote sensing data, and specifically pipelines that make accessing those remote sensing data much easier than it used to be. And then also significant advances in statistical modeling development and machine learning modeling development that make it possible to integrate all these data sets together. So, Nan will get into the details about that in a little bit, but I just want to emphasize in terms of the program design, the reason this market is possible and the reason we can structure it the way we do is because of all these advances in technology over the last few years. So just real briefly, in terms of how this works, we have an enrollment period, so companies can enroll their acres. We provide an assessment for risk of harvest as well as carbon storage, and again, Nan will get into that in just a little bit. On a quarterly basis, we run fulfillment events to match supply and demand. So suppliers are able to set their price, buyers are able to purchase carbon credits, and then landowners agree to defer harvest for a 1-year term. And then we go through a verification process, which involves some local cruising in order to verify carbon stocks so that we can deliver verified carbon credits to our buyers. So, just in terms of a little bit of what we've been up to, in summer of 2021, we've enrolled about 1.2 million acres across 16 states and 3 ecoregions. Currently, most of the acreage coming from the U.S. South, but as you can see, a pretty significant portion of acreage in the lake states, as well as in Pennsylvania and New York as well. So this is going to total to about 500,000 total tons of expected carbon sequestered. Roughly 575 participating landowners, with a good chunk of those represented by consulting foresters. So consulting foresters are playing a really, really important role in our program design in terms of helping us connect with landowners and helping landowners make good and informed decisions in terms of participating in our program. And some of our buyers for our early rounds of carbon credits are listed here as well. So that's kind of the context of the program, just so you all understand that a little bit. And we can get into that a little bit more in the Q&A session. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Nan to get into the real kind of nitty-gritty of our technological approaches.
Hi, everybody. I am up in the Rocky Mountains with some of our team this week and keeping my video off because the views are amazing, but the internet isn't quite as strong as I expected it would be. So thank you, Brian, for that introduction. And as he mentioned, a lot of what we do as a company is made possible by the technology that we have developed over the last decade. And the key part of that is our basemap data product. Many of you, if you've been party to SAF meetings and other things, have probably heard our team present about basemap in some capacity in the past. But I'll go over kind of the background of what this is and how we make it, just to give a better sense of what it is that we're doing to develop this high resolution information that we're able to build on top of. So basemap is a high resolution forest map of the entire continental United States. It's a 30-meter resolution data product. And the way that it's formed from estimates of the sizes, counts, and species of trees at that 30-meter resolution. So we're using a combination of multiple dates of remote sensing information and FIA plot data through a series of models, first to predict the forest type across the country, and then within forest type to be generating estimates of the count and species of trees at that 30-meter pixel resolution. And one thing we have seen over the last few years is we've been able to put a lot of resources into improving the quality of this product year over year. Our first generation of basemap was created in 2018. Since then, we've updated it every year. So we had a 2019, 2020, and just recently finished the 2021 basemap rollout. One thing that we're particularly excited about is that the 2021 data product, we've been able to go beyond just a single set of estimates for each one of those pixels, but to generate multiple repeat predictions of what might be present on a given pixel, so that we have a much better distribution of uncertainty and the ability to sort of capture not only what we know, but how confident we are in what we know about the forests at that, again, 30-meter resolution. So we use basemap to make it possible to generate estimates of seeming carbon and estimates of the amount of carbon that a landowner can bring to market without doing any field measurements on any of these properties. So landowners are able to just enroll in our platform, upload their property bounds or select property bounds, and request a report that will give them estimates of how much carbon that they could bring, and make available for sale. And all of that is possible because we have this starting estimate of carbon. We then go through the process of designing a field sample for properties that are accepted. So in the previous slide, that map of these are the properties that are actually participating in our summer cycle of this year. We installed field plots covering that area. And those plots are used in conjunction with the basemap data set to develop a more refined estimate of starting carbon. That is going to be that is one of the pieces that goes into the final accounting of carbon within our methodological framework. So Brian, can you move to the next slide there? Yeah. So here's a little bit more of the history of basemap. In our earliest version, we had a series of an ensemble of models that sort of fed off one another, but were somewhat independent in how they were fit, and very, very heavily relied on just imagery inputs to predict the structure, species composition, species mixtures. And the final result was definitely something we're incredibly proud of and felt confident making decisions off of, but had relatively low precision. And definitely we saw a lot of ways that we could improve it over time. And we have been really challenged to do that. And over the last year have doubled the size of our data science team to really invest in improving that data product. So in its current form for 2021, we sort of explicitly encoded a lot more of what we know through a new approach to modeling, integrating into a Bayesian modeling framework with a hierarchical structure and priors that are defined from what we actually know about how forests grow. So while a lot of technological companies these days you hear a lot of talk about AI and a lot of talk about machine learning, and our team is really focused on taking the best of what we can from those AI and machine learning type techniques, but also building really robust and rigorous models that capture the knowledge that we have as data scientists, as foresters and ecologists. So the end result of that is better and more realistic predictions of what the current forest condition is. And this is really critical to what we're trying to do as a company, and quantifying the forests of the United States, and also developing a rigorous framework that we can use to extend the base map data product outside the US moving forward. So we've been working with Verra, who's a third-party carbon certification body, to develop a new methodology for how to do carbon accounting through the framework that we are using as a company, which includes, you've probably heard discussed, our process is built off of one-year terms, which is extremely novel, and carbon that's deferred from a harvest for 1 year can be essentially converted to what that carbon would, how much carbon that would be over 99 years or longer, just through a series of like mathematical equations. So that makes it possible for us to enroll landowners in a 1-year term and quantify the impact of that project for 1 year, but also over a larger time scale. Part of developing this methodology has been developing a model and an approach to quantifying what we think of as additionality, which is to say, what would be happening across the landscape in the absence of a carbon project that's incentivizing landowners to defer harvest. So our process is really geared towards working forests, and incentivizing landowners to defer harvest is only actually affecting change if these are landowners that were intending to harvest otherwise. And so we've really invested in building out a new framework and approach to quantify how likely it is that an area will be harvested in the next year, and then how much carbon would be removed if a harvest took place. So we've done this primarily through leveraging FIA data, but in addition, a lot of other spatial information. And the goal here is to be able to leverage our base map data set to generate those estimates for new properties, and then to improve and update those estimates once landowners are actually accepted into the process through a combination of base map and plot data. So the framework that we're using to estimate that business as usual harvesting behavior across the landscape, as I said, is primarily leveraging the FIA data set. FIA is an incredibly powerful and rich data set, and one of the things that we have been able to extract from that information is harvesting behavior because of the remeasurement cycles that are put in place. So as plots are revisited, we get the ability to follow through time which plots were harvested, how much carbon was removed, what species are being removed, is it certain size classes, all of the patterns of behavior that we can use to understand in a new property based on what we see over time in this region and in this area. How likely is it that this property is going to be harvested, and then what kind of harvest is going to take place there? So we don't want to blindly assume, for example, that people are going to be clear cutting their northern hardwood stands, but rather to say, all right, well, on average, a northern hardwood stand in the Northwoods has 20% removal of carbon. So if this is a property or landowner that intends to harvest, this is how much carbon there is, and this is how much we expect to be removed if a harvest took place. And from that, we can quantify, again, the additionality, or so what is the actual magnitude of impact of that landowner choosing to defer that harvest for 1 year. In addition to using the FIA data, we've also been able to make extensive use of the National Woodland Owner Survey data set. So the National Woodland Owner Survey is also conducted by the U.S. Forest Service. Brett Butler is the lead of that program, and he works out of the Northeastern office. And surveys are mailed to landowners across the country, somewhat similar to the sampling process that's used for the FIA data. And so landowners are asked tons of questions about their behavior, their motivation, their tenure on their land, you know, sort of their objectives for owning it, what they've done in the past, what they hope to do in the future. And what we can get from that is the patterns of behavior and what proportion of landowners in a given area are actually landowners who intend to harvest. And that's used to, again, you know, refine our ability to estimate whether landowners that engage with our program are ones who intend to be harvesting. We're also leveraging other remote sensing information because we have the base map data set and we can generate estimates of the standing carbon in an area, but not just carbon, but also because we're predicting individual stems, we have the ability to estimate the volume in a given area and the value by combining estimates of volume with stumpage value from a given area, basically in real time, because through different subscriptions in the South, there's a Timber Mart South data set that gives you, you can get quarterly updates of stumpage prices. What is being paid for different products this quarter in this region? And similarly in the Northwoods, the Forest Data Network is a great service provider that provides harvest information and stumpage value in Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota. So we've been able to combine that kind of information as well to really localize what's the standing volume in this property, what's the value of it, and then how is that also expected to contribute to a landowner's decision to harvest and what might be removed. So the functional form here, for people who are more interested in those details, is rooted in a publication from the early 2000s by Pressman and Ware. Harvest likelihood is a function of basically 3 different broad groups of information: timber value, the cost of harvest, and the non-timber value. So cost of harvest is linked to proximity to roads, proximity to mills, and accessibility and slope, information like that, the kind of stand-specific information that's used to understand when a harvest is going to be viable. Non-timber value is an interesting part of this process and a place of really focused work for us moving forward. But right now, non-timber value is essentially looking at, if we think about landowners who are growing forests, not to merchandise the timber, but for other things, there's a point of a complex forest structure where more complicated structure and more standing volume is actually indicative that a landowner doesn't intend to harvest. So building that component into the model helps capture that sort of that tipping point in a way. And we're able to apply these, to build these functions out sort of grouped by individual landowner type. So we know that the behavior of family forest owners is different from the behavior of more industrially focused forest owners and TMOs and REITs, and is different from how public agencies make decisions and from how NGOs who own land make decisions. And so all of that is information that we've tried to encode into this process to be able to generate these estimates of harvest likelihood. And again, that portion of the model produces this probability of harvest ranging from 0 to 1 for a given acre, and aggregated over that, pixels to acres, aggregated over to the entire property for someone who's enrolled. And then secondarily, what proportion of carbon would be removed if that harvest took place. So as I walked through, that's really looking at, encoding into the model the behavior of how harvests actually are planned and what people remove when they harvest. And those things together give us this estimate of carbon that's at risk for removal in a given area each year.
Okay, and yep. So this is Brian again. So thanks, Nan, for that great overview. And I get to brag since I didn't actually work on it, but the harvest likelihood model that Nan and the rest of our forestry crew, Nathan Rutenbeck and Joe Shannon, have designed is really, really cool. They've done some incredible work, I think, integrating some different kinds of data sets to build that out. So yeah, I mean, just one kind of final note on our carbon methodology before I pivot to talk about just a few other things before we wrap up here. Like Nan mentioned at the top, we're working with Verra, so we're on the path to certification of this methodology. And it's been a little bit of a process, mainly because as Nan explained, the ton-year accounting approach is a new framework for them. So we've gone through a round of expert review and several rounds of feedback to kind of settle in on that. But we're expecting, we've had our initial concept note approved. The methodology has now been submitted, and we're kind of looking forward to being able to deliver fully certified credits under this Verra methodology in pretty short order here. So, for the last few minutes here, I just wanted to talk a little bit about where we're going from here. Forest carbon is going to remain the pillar of NCX, and I think that's appropriate because it's a large market, and of course the imperative is serious in terms of being able to leverage some of these market-based solutions to help mitigate the effects of climate change going forward. But like I mentioned off the top, I mean, there are a lot of other forms of natural capital that we could look at incorporating in this kind of market-based framework as well, right? So we talked about timber and carbon, wildfire risk reduction. I mean, that's obviously a big one, especially for the Western United States, right? In terms of the ability of market-based instruments to be able to incentivize better fire management practices. Biodiversity and wildlife habitat is something that we're really interested in as kind of a starting point for looking towards integrating these other types of natural capital. I mean, we all know we're sort of in an ongoing species extinction event globally, largely due to habitat loss and degradation. So, what's the potential for these kind of market-based programs to be able to better incentivize management practices or harvest deferrals that will lead to more biodiversity or preservation of biodiversity on the landscape, both in the United States and then elsewhere. And then water quality, of course, too, is another big one that, is often talked about in terms of these market-based frameworks. And then finally, afforestation. We're not going to talk much about this as well, but definitely something that we're looking into integrating into our program also. Obviously, when you're talking about paying landowners to plant trees rather than simply defer harvest, it leads to a pretty different structured market. But that's also something that we're kind of keeping on our radar here. So, like I mentioned, biodiversity is our real starting point here for stepping into the considering multiple forms of natural capital in our market. And the reason for this is because there's really significant interest in biodiversity offsets right now. If you've been following the goings on at COP this week at all, of course, carbon and climate change is front and center, but biodiversity preservation and biodiversity conservation is kind of, often the second or third thing that people will cite in terms of where we really need to make inroads globally. And, I mean, I think the reasons for this are obvious, right? I mean, it's, in part maybe a bit of a moral imperative to reverse some of these species extinction events, but clearly, maintaining biodiversity has a huge amount of value for us, both in terms of directly harvested forest products, as well as the role that biodiversity plays in maintaining all these other ecosystem services that we depend on, right? Whether it's carbon sequestration or improving the capacity of forests to store water, et cetera. So, all that being said, we're really at the initial point of starting to think about how a biodiversity offset should and could be structured within a carbon program. So, we're kind of really just at the initial planning stages and asking really broad questions, like simply, in the context of this market-based space, like how does it make sense to index biodiversity? Should we be focused on single species? So, if you know anything about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conservation banking program, that's a mitigation market that has a very species-specific approach, right? You can set up conservation banks to do targeted conservation for specific threatened and endangered species. Or in this kind of more voluntary market framework, does it make sense to look a little bit more broadly, in terms of focusing on things that might be indicators of overall biodiversity and ecosystem health, whether it's species richness, forest nesting birds, I think are a group that are interesting to us simply, in part because of the obvious relationship to carbon storage. But, this is a group of organisms that's facing really significant decline, kind of nationally, and most of the species that are rapidly declining are not really afforded protection under the Endangered Species Act. So, maybe a little bit of a conservation market inefficiency there. And of course, pollinators are, in terms of the ecosystem service they provide, maybe a less, appropriate model for forests versus some agricultural-based projects, but, always top of mind. So, all of this is to say, it's one thing to start thinking about integrating these multiple forms of natural capital. And, of course, there's a huge technological component that'll come in terms of our ability to forecast it. But in order to kind of get from point A to point B, we have really large and broad programmatic questions that we're currently asking and looking to answer in order to figure out sort of the right pathway to pursue this particular part of our program. So, just in terms of one example of the type of question we'll be wrestling with, Nan just spent the last 15 minutes or so walking through our business as usual reference scenario for carbon, right? So the modeling framework we use to estimate background harvest behavior so that we can demonstrate additionality in our carbon credits. Well, if we're going to develop biodiversity offsets, again, whether it's for a single species or some kind of more generic metric, we're probably going to need that same kind of framework, right? Like we're going to need some ability to model the reference scenario where, if NCX biodiversity offset program was not implemented, what likely would have happened in terms of background harvesting, management decisions that folks are making on their lands, et cetera. And, for biodiversity type metrics, that reference scenario could be significantly different from carbon, right? So, here's one example. This is the golden cheek warbler, maybe not a great Minnesota example, given this is a Texas species, but it's an interesting one from this case because it is a species that has been subject to several Fish and Wildlife Service conservation bank programs. It's an endangered species that's endemic to these kind of scrubby juniper oak woodlands in central Texas. So, if we were thinking about a business as usual reference scenario for golden cheek warbler habitat credits, I think pretty clearly there's a spatial dimension that would have to come into play that maybe doesn't matter so much for carbon, right? And here in this example, we've got kind of two theoretical parcels that could be looking to enroll our program. One is larger and closer to a source population of golden cheek warblers. The other one is smaller and further away. In just looking at carbon, the position of those tracks on the landscape wouldn't matter nearly as much as our estimated carbon and timber value. But in this case, we almost surely need to account for those metapopulation dynamics in order to really be able to fully kind of value the ability of a property to contribute, into additional, in this case, golden cheek warbler habitat credits. So this is just one example. This isn't necessarily what we're going to do, but meant to just be illustrative of the kinds of complexities that are introduced by considering these other forms of natural capital, right? Suddenly then we have multiple models of business as usual scenarios, and Nan referenced that kind of non-timber value pool of variables that go into our carbon estimation, you know, going forward, maybe that's kind of the point where these things are linked in order to be able to understand the trade-offs among you know, different kinds of natural capital. And you know, those trade-offs are going to be real, right? You know, thinking about fire mitigation again as a motivating example, you know, in the short term, which is what we're interested in, given we have an annual deferral program, thinning in order to decrease fire risk may be counterintuitive to our carbon program, right? So our ability to be able to understand those trade-offs and help you know, be able to accurately value properties ourselves and be able to help landowners make those decisions about how they want to interact with our own properties is going to be really, really critical to us getting this right. And you know, that kind of tees up the last thing I wanted to mention here. You know, we've been talking specifically about the market and the technology surrounding the market, but for us at NCX, the content delivery side of this is really, really critical as well. And it goes both ways, right? Like we want to be able to communicate the full value of the carbon credits we can supply to our buyers. So, you know, think of all these co-benefits that we were just talking about, right? But we also want to be able to continue investing in tools that are going to help landowners and especially consulting foresters, you know, make good decisions about participating in our program or others. So, you know, that's kind of where I think the sort of democratization aspect of what we're trying to do really comes into play. You know, we want landowners to be well-informed participants in the program. We want consulting foresters who are helping landowners make decisions about participating in these programs to be well-equipped to really critically assess the value of our program for landowners that they're working with. And you know, as a result, we're investing a lot in tooling that will help. Hopefully help, you know, as we kind of start building it out. So consultant dashboards as well as landowner facing dashboards that will leverage some of the information we can extract from Basemap and give it, you know, directly to people participating in the program so that they can use it to make their own management decisions. Case studies and educational materials, where this is a component of our business that we're really rapidly scaling up and starting to figure out the right, you know, forums and tempo and pace for bringing some of these things out, as well as webinars and panel discussions, which we've been over the last 6 months or so really starting to scale those up as well. So for instance, our director of origination just yesterday presented a webinar to interested landowners that walk through the bidding process for participating in NCX. And, you know, down the line in the next 6 to 12 months or so, some of this information of other forms of natural capital will start to come online too, right? So as we look to pilot biodiversity offsets, we're going to be investing very significantly in research and development to figure out how we integrate Basemap with relevant data sets, whether it's you know, breeding bird survey data, other kinds of data sets that might tell us something about whether it's abundance or occupancy or just habitat quality of species on the landscape. You know, we're looking forward to bringing some of that to people as well. So, you know, not too much I can say in terms of specifics about that at this point, because it's still very much in the planning stage, but, you know, just something to look forward to if you keep in touch with us over the next 6 or 12 months, that the content side of our business is really going to increase beyond just the eligibility reports for the carbon program that we deliver. So with that, I will leave it there. Thanks very much, everyone, for listening in, and thanks again to Matt and Eli for organizing this this webinar series and inviting us. You know, we're super happy to be participating. It's a very great and important topic, and I believe we should have plenty of time for questions here now.
Yeah, there are a few really interesting questions in the Slido app. If you post some questions in there, I did try to go through and I answered some of them directly, but there were a few that I wanted to make sure that we could talk through sort of in real time. You know, so this top question being, How does a 1-year harvest deferral address the permanence aspect of carbon sequestration? And how is that reflected in the value of these types of carbon offsets? And without getting too far into the actual like modeling and technical framework there, at the high level, that is addressed through this process of converting tons of carbon to units we think of as ton years. So 1 ton of carbon sequestered for 1 year can be converted through to the equivalent. What is the equivalence of that in terms of tons that are permanently sequestered? So that is reflected in a paper that's currently under review and revision, and then also is again spelled out directly in our methodology. And I do want to emphasize that none of this is intended to be sort of opaque. Our methodology will be made available for public review, and Vera will gather comments and feedback, and that's something that's built into the process of any new methodology that's developed with a verifying body. And so the details of that will be laid out in there, and that's something that should be available later this winter. But yeah, it's not as simple as, well, this 1 year of carbon, this 1 ton for 1 year is the same as 1 ton forever, but rather that there's actually a mathematical relationship that's used to define how that is, sort of how that converts to a permanent ton. And that's built into how also the pricing that we use in terms of what the landowners are paid for that behavior sort of takes into consideration the conversion of that 1 year commitment through to a permanent ton.
Yeah. I'll just add on to that real quick. From the program perspective, I mean, part of the idea here, certainly with the shorter term deferral, it definitely introduces more complexities in terms of demonstrating permanence than a longer term contract. But, I think it's also critical to note that it lowers the barrier of entry, right? And that's really part of our model, is, operating with a program framework that allows us to bring as many acres in as we can. Because, it's nice with a longer term contract to be able to have a simpler permanence equation. But if the cost of entry is then, much higher for a landowner, whether it's in terms of just administrative costs for enrolling or, lost opportunity costs in terms of having their property tied up for many, many years, I think it's kind of becomes an interesting question then about, what kind of impact that's going to have in terms of bringing people on board.
Yep. And then the second question here, which again is I think a really astute question. How do you deal with the fact that publicly available FIA data do not provide the true plot locations and instead provide a fuzz location? So for people who might not be familiar with this, the FIA plot data are, because they are installed across private lands as well as public lands, the quote unquote true locations of those plots are not made available to the general public and are only available to FIA staff, and shared sometimes with researchers under pretty intense confidentiality agreements, all of which is sort of specified by law and designed to both protect sort of the validity of the sample and the identities of individual landowners. So that means that the data that we are working with are the data that have permuted plot locations. So fuzzed or sort of shuffled lat longs rather than the actual point that was measured. And so this is why our process builds in the modeling framework that we're using. We first are looking at predicting forest type and then structure within forest type. So we're able to leverage more of what we can gather from the FIA plots about the forest structure of different forest types, species composition, and size and species distributions that are somewhat aspatial once you have that forest type information. And secondly, the modeling approach that we're using is designed to allow us to integrate into the training data set the knowledge we have about the positional uncertainty of the plots in a way that lets us account for it, rather than just sort of strictly linking a pixel to a plot, knowing that that's not actually where that plot is. So it's not a simple solution, but it's something that we've invested a lot of time into. and are really leveraging sort of everything we know about ecology as well as statistics to handle the fact that we have these fuzzed plot locations. We are also able to sort of validate and assess our basement data set against plot data that we actually have the true knowledge of, because we install a field sample for each one of our cycles. We're continually gathering a lot of really valuable plot data and using that to assess and improve our basement data set over time. I believe that the other questions that are showing I answered.
I wonder if you'd be willing to briefly address those in verbally too.
Oh, sure.
And I did see some nice, I thought that was you because Brian was talking when those.
Yeah, Brian was talking and I was in there answering. Yep.
But
yeah, I'm happy to talk through it too.
Great.
I know not everybody's able to sort of look at both screens at the same time. So what factors do you consider in assessing risk of harvest, and how common is it to reject an application due to low harvest risk? So the factors that are considered.
Uh-oh, I just lost Nan's audio. Hopefully we'll get that back in a moment. I'll point out, and Brian, I don't know if you want to jump in, but this question I think was posted kind of early, and this was discussed during part of the presentation, looking at the National Woodland Owner Survey and other sources. Brian, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, and just for context here, I formerly was working in Nan's group, so I have basic literacy in this, but things change at NCX so quickly at this point. I feel like I hardly know where they landed with the final model. But yeah, Nan did kind of review this in the presentation, but basically it's a two-part model. The first component that assesses the harvest risk itself, and then the second component that assesses the amount of carbon removed. So the harvest risk model, again, off the top of my head, I don't know the exact formulation, but it includes variables like merchantable value, total standing volume. It has a distance to road component as well as a distance to mill component. So it's aimed to kind of to capture both the all of the factors that maybe kind of influence the harvestability of an individual stand based on its position in the landscape, the value of the stand, et cetera. And then the carbon removal component, that's really where the combination of FIA and National Woodland Owner Survey data comes into play in terms of leveraging that kind of information to understand how landowners of different types are actually kind of conducting their harvests. I think that part to me is the one that's really interesting in terms of where it could go from there, because I think even with that combination of FIA and NWOS, like we're really only scratching the surface in terms of the number or variety of different kinds of socioeconomic factors that are going to influence harvest, right? Or you can, I'm sure, think of many problems with even just treating small woodland owners as like one monolithic group when there are people who have very, very different motivations and reasonings for understanding their properties, and those are obviously really going to influence their management decisions. So going forward in terms of improving the BAU model, that's an area where we'll really be focusing. We'll be looking at what other kinds of information we can leverage, from a variety of different data sources to better represent, try to capture that kind of harvest, decision-making process that underlies a harvest. And, this is a part that obviously is really important for us to get right? And, the last thing I want to say on it, it is a bit unusual compared to a lot of other offset programs to be modeling this business as usual scenario with the depth that Nan and her team have. Very often these are fairly assumption driven, or in some cases, particularly in some international examples of offset programs, not necessarily employed with anything other than just a very generic, background guess based on deforestation rates. So, we're investing a lot of R&D and a lot of people's time into improving this and making sure we get it right. And that in part adds trust to our market, and also, like I kind of mentioned, means that we're able to provide much better information back to landowners and CFs as well.
Yeah, and sorry, I disappeared and I came back again. One other piece to add there is that this isn't a model that sort of we can just build behind the curtain and surface the information at the end without any transparency, but rather the entire process has been subject to like rigorous expert review as part of the process of having our methodology developed within Verra. So there's a lot of rules and standards about how exactly those models can be developed, and they need to be vetted and challenged by experts, and we've recently completed that process as part of our work. So
I would think, and you can maybe comment on this, but there are several questions about this that are a little bit skeptical, and I think we may not see it, but we should remind ourselves that you're in a competitive marketplace too. There are other carbon offset credit providers or project developers other than NCX, and if you want buyers to buy your credits, they need to be verifiable and so on. I would think so. There's an incentive
Absolutely.
for you, as you're saying, Nan, and Brian, to make sure that this holds up.
Yeah, and I'm happy to sort of answer. I see this question again. From a practical standpoint, if a landowner harvests the stand 1 year later, what has been gained in terms of the amount of carbon sequestered? I want to again emphasize that the methodology that we've developed and that we are using to create the carbon projects that we are is entirely geared around quantifying the amount of carbon sequestered from a 1 year harvest deferral. So it is entirely focused on the additionality of what would be removed if a landowner is going to harvest, and if they instead defer that harvest for 1 year, how much carbon has been sequestered. So it's not an answer that I can give in terms of like, oh, the answer is 5, but that is precisely the number that the methodology is set up to quantify, and that value is converted to a unit of like a single carbon credit that's issued by the verifying body through the same process. And at that point, those are sort of fiduciary values, and they don't. Each carbon credit is essentially fungible. So that is precisely what our process is geared towards doing, is quantifying the amount of carbon sequestered from a 1 year harvest deferral.
Yeah, and then just building off that and what Eli said before, I mean, the trust component of this is really critical, right? Like we're heavily incentivized to get our method certified by Verra, which means that it's available for public review. But beyond that, I mean, we're heavily incentivized to make this all as transparent as possible, which is definitely, part of our roadmap. I mean, this kind of space that we operate in, like if we can't demonstrate that the methodology is real and sound, that is a significant source of trouble for us for sure. So, I think that isn't unique to us, right? I mean, I think that's just comes with the territory of operating in the space, whether you're doing carbon or as we start to turn to other forms of natural capital. I mean, in that case, looking at biodiversity, for instance, we don't even necessarily have the kind of standard pathway with a third-party certifier to follow. We're going to have to do a little bit more kind of independent work in terms of figuring out how we integrate different available international standards, historical precedents, et cetera, to do it correctly. And then in that case, absolutely the underlying methodology, down to the predictive models that generate the indices, all that stuff needs to be available, whether it's in the literature or in some cases just open source software. So I mean that's a big part of our business is for sure. I mean that's kind of one of the pillars of our company.
Great. So a couple of quick ones here. Are any offset credits available through NCX for practices other than deferred harvest? That was a simple answer. Nan said no, not at this time.
We are not just, we're the project developers as well as selling the credits. And so we're only developing under one methodology at this time.
Great.
But that will undoubtedly change going forward. Although the exact timeline and what and how is still unknown for sure.
So this is a question that I've heard come up. In the Lake States, Aspen forms a big share of our forest cover and also of the harvest. Aspen is a short-lived species, and so what happens to overmature or high-risk stands that may actually start losing carbon through senescence, wildfire, or insect and disease mortality if not harvested? How does that fit into NCX's model?
So because we make measurements both through remote sensing and field data at the beginning and end of term, landowners are not credited for deferring harvest if some other disruption happens on the landscape. So if, for example, a wildfire, I think is the most tractable and sort of decisive change that one might see, where if a property is enrolled in the project for a 1-year deferral commitment, but a wildfire comes through, that landowner there's no credited carbon there because, again, the carbon was released to the atmosphere rather than sequestered on the landscape for the 1-year term. We do also, this is a big part of why we are so excited to be working with consulting foresters and have these relationships strengthened between our company, private landowners, and consulting foresters, because there are many properties where the right long-term management decision isn't to defer harvest for 1 year, but rather to instead harvest. And we want to make sure that landowners are equipped to make that kind of decision and to be able to weigh not just the near-term financial gains of getting a 1-year deferral credit, but also what is the impact on the forest of that? Because for working forests, like, there is going to be a point where the long-term, preferred objective would likely to be to harvest. And we certainly don't want to incentivize, what basically become detriments to forest health over time.
So we've only got a couple of minutes left. This has been really good. I'll draw folks' attention. If you're interested in continuing education credits, I did post the link to the form you need to complete. It'll only take a moment, but do look for that in the chat, the continuing education credit request link. Matt will close us out here in a minute or two, but before we get there, I wonder if you two can take one more question.
Sure.
Does deferred harvesting prevent intermediate thinning? And related to that, how do you manage a situation where, let's say, a landowner has 240 contiguous acres, they're ready to harvest maybe 10 acres, but they decide to defer? Can they, or what happens in a situation where the risk of harvest is really variable across a property? Do you only offer offset credits for some portion of that property with a high harvest risk, or do you average it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So landowners are required to enroll all of their holdings if they're going to enroll any, and that is to prevent what we think of as leakage within a property. So if you owned 2 parcels and you weren't sure if you were going to harvest one of them or both of them, it would be, perhaps rational to enroll one of them and then harvest the other. But that's considered leakage within the parlance of carbon accounting. And so landowners are required to enroll their entire property, and the assessment is done for the entire property. Again, to sort of avoid that shifting and moving of a planned harvest around, they're provided with a single number as an estimate of total carbon at risk on the property rather than spatial information, because we don't want people to sort of cherry pick where they could harvest versus what it is that we are estimating on their property. But yeah, so in that case, what we really encourage landowners to do is just defer harvest for the planned harvests for the next year. But for particularly large landowners, right, when you get into people who own hundreds, thousands of acres, they are not going to just not harvest. They may have wood supply agreements with mills and other commitments that have been made. And so at that point, landowners are allowed to, we say, hey, this is how much carbon is estimated to be at risk across the whole property. And they're allowed to bid into the marketplace a commitment to defer some portion of that rather than the entirety. And so that's then used to evaluate their behavior compared to the baseline and compared to, so we look at the starting and end conditions and the business as usual baseline, and then how much harvest was deferred.
Thanks, Nan. Matt, over to you.
Great. Well, this has been a great webinar to learn more about what NCX is up to and learn more about the data that's really driving the base map product and everything that you're all doing. So we will give you all a virtual round of applause. Brian and Nan, thank you very much for sharing everything. Thanks, Eli, for handling all those questions that came in. I do want to remind you of a couple of things. Eli just posted in the chat the continuing education credit form. If you're seeking that, please go ahead and click on that. And then our last webinar in this series is going to happen on Friday morning. And so that will be with Chad Babcock from U of M Department of Forest Resources. He'll talk about remote sensing data and thinking about uncertainty in some of the forest carbon estimates that a lot of products use. So we do hope that you join us on Friday as well. With that, Brian, Nan, thank you again, and we'll sign off. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye.